The essence of the report I've received is that there was unsatisfactory lack of clarity over responsibility for dealing with this consular case. And it was a very peculiar consular case, I've got to say quickly. But the lack of clarity needs to be sorted out, and I'm accepting the recommendations, a half dozen or so recommendations from the inquiry for clarifying responsibility in consular cases like this that have got a security implication. Mr. Zygier was at the time of his arrest an employee of the Israeli government and dual Australian-Israeli citizen. There's a convention that I feel committed to that has foreign ministers not able to comment on matters of intelligence or security. But let me say this, Mr. Zygier worked for the Israeli government, and open source material, as security services would call it, suggest he worked in the intelligence arm of the Israeli government. You can draw your own conclusions. We've therefore got a circumstance where someone went from Australia to live in Israel for 10 years to become a dual Israeli-Australian citizen, who worked for the Israeli government, and according to reports worked for a security arm of the Israeli government, and ended up in prison. None of those above facts, while they complicate the case, absolves us from responsibility for attending to our consular duty. And this is where the department appears to have failed. There should have been more attention, more visits, and a follow-up on the guarantees that we received from the Israeli government. The Israeli government said that they would respect his position, and indeed he had 50, this stands out for me, he had 50 visits from his family during the period that he was in jail. 50 visits from his family and visits from his lawyer, and at no time did his family or his lawyer come to the Australian government and say they needed assistance. This is an important consideration. I've got to say there are unanswered questions here about the nature of unanswered questions about the use of Australian passports by dual nationals working for the government of their other country of nationality, and they're not easily resolved. But I do want to say that if it transpires that Australian passports were used for security or intelligence gathering by Israel in this case, it's something to which we take the strongest opposition. No country can allow the integrity of its passport system to be compromised. That places at risk its own citizens. We know that in 2010 there was an episode of this in Dubai. We can't say whether it happened with Mr. Zygier's several passports. I hope the inquiry that takes place, one of the inquiries taking place in Israel, can clarify this position. Yes, Israeli authorities reportedly gave an assurance to ASIO that Mr. Zygier would be, quote, afforded the full legal rights of an Israeli citizen, unquote. This was conveyed to ASIO, by ASIO to DFAT on February 24, 2010. It included the assurance that legal representation had been made available to him, that his legal rights were being respected, that his family was aware of his arrest and detention, and that he was in good health and was not being mistreated. But I really think it's unsatisfactory that things rested there instead of the officers of the Australian Embassy being able to make visits and see for themselves. And that's what we're going to resolve by the attention to the protocol I'll come to in a moment. The decision not to follow up reflected an assessment that Israel would probably not grant consular access to Mr. Zygier, reflected an assessment that Mr. Zygier was being treated as an Israeli citizen, which he was, he'd been there for 10 years, and that Mr. Zygier's family knew of his arrest and had not sought assistance from the Australian government, and of course they did not do so over the next 10 months. The report recommends what I might summarise as a whole of government protocol. Among the provisions it recommends is that the head of mission that is the Australian ambassador in the country concerned, be informed, even though an Australian intelligence agency might consider it has access. The Australian ambassador in Tel Aviv wasn't informed of this. If he or she had been, I'm certain they would have beaten the path to the Israeli authorities and sought access to Mr Zygier to satisfy themselves that the assurances given to ASIO by the Israeli government were being respected. By the way, I can confirm that the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security has released a statement today saying that after speaking to senior Australian intelligence officials and reviewing their relevant records, she has not looked into the actions of DFAT, as that department's not within her ordinary jurisdiction, but based on the information that she's considered, she's come to the conclusion that there is no evidence that ASIO has acted improperly or unlawfully in this matter, and advised the Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, that she doesn't intend to initiate a formal inquiry. I'll conclude by just saying something about the peculiarity of this case again. Mr Zygier doesn't here present an ordinary consular case. It is a consular case, but not an ordinary one. He is someone who went off to live in another country. He lived there 10 years, took out citizenship in that country, worked for its government, and if reports are to be believed, worked for one of its intelligence services. Not something I can deny or confirm, but you can draw your own conclusion from the open source material available to you as much as to me. It is difficult for us in these circumstances, but more care should have been taken. With a whole of government protocol in place, I'm confident that even in difficult intelligence cases like this, more care will be taken in the future. No amount of care, I believe, would have addressed the inherent challenge in dealing with the situation of someone who, for whatever reason, was held captive by the government he worked for, a government of the country that represented his other nationality. As for our relations with Israel on this matter, Israelis did provide the family access, as I said, 50 visits and the visit of his legal representations. We received, again I emphasise this, no complaints from his family, no complaints from his lawyer about access. We did seek details of the charges against him, but the Israeli government declined to provide this. It's covered by a gag order within Israel, as you're aware. We await the outcome of the apparently several inquiries being carried out in Israel, or foreshadowed in Israel. We reserve our right to seek further information from Israel when those inquiries report. Just note that the Australian government hasn't got the capacity to conduct an inquiry in Israel into matters related to his imprisonment. We can't ask prison guards or officers of Israeli government agencies to present themselves at the Australian Embassy in Tel Aviv and answer our questions. We've got to rely on information we are given by that government. But certainly if Australian passports were misused here, that's something we are forced to take very seriously, because no country can live with any erosion of the integrity of its passport system. If the world thinks that Australian passports are routinely debauched by another country, then Australians presenting their passport somewhere in the world could well face their lives in danger. We can't live with that. And if that's confirmed, we'll be registering the strongest protest.